In the dark parts of New York in the 1970s, a man's name would soon be known for violence, being hard to predict, and finally, a big mystery. Thomas DeSimone was not just another mobster dot. He was the kind of scary person that even tough criminals were afraid of. Tonight, we're looking closely at the very bloody story of Tommy Two Guns, a story so cruel and strange that the movies had to make it less scary. Before we go into Tommy's world of mess and fighting, tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. Write your city and time zone in the comments below. Maybe you're relaxing after a long day in London, or it is the middle of the night in New York. We are all here together for this amazing trip through mob history. If you are new here, click that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We bring you the most interesting true crime and gangster stories every day. And if this story gets you interested, show some love with a like. Trust me, Tommy's story is one you will not want to miss. The bright lights of Times Square made long shadows on the dirty streets of New York in the 1970s. The city had no money. Crime was everywhere. And in the darkest parts of Brooklyn and Queens, men like Thomas DeSimone grew strong like animals in a city jungle. This was not the make-believe mob world you see in movies. This was raw, scary, and very real. Thomas DeSimone's story is not just another mob story. It is a story about going crazy. It is the story of a man who took the already violent world of organized crime and pushed it past any kind of good sense. He was the monster that other monsters talked about in scared voices. He was the wild card that even experienced killers tried to stay away from. But Tommy's story starts long before he became a famous criminal. It starts in the simple neighborhoods of Massachusetts and Brooklyn in the years after the war, when America was figuring out who it was, and young men like Tommy DeSimone were figuring out who they were in all the wrong ways. Now let's go back to Brooklyn in the 1950s, where our story starts. Thomas Anthony DeSimone was born on May 24, 1950, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in a way that seemed to predict his future. Born into a working-class Italian-American family, Tommy's first few years were shaky with money, which was a problem for many families who moved to America after the war. His father, Frank DeSimone, worked in construction when he could get a job. His mother, Dolores, had a hard time keeping the family together when they had little money. The DeSimone family was not part of organized crime at first, but they lived in neighborhoods where the line between working hard and getting money illegally was very thin. Young Tommy saw these two different things from a young age, watching as some families got rich by being connected to the mob life, while others, like his own, just got by on honest work that never seemed to pay enough. When Tommy was 5 years old, the family made a choice that would change everything. They packed their few belongings and moved to the East New York neighborhood in Brooklyn. East New York in the 1950s was a mix of hope and sadness, where Italian, Irish, and Jewish families lived in crowded apartment buildings and houses, with each group having its own social ranks and rules that were not written down. The Brooklyn that the DeSimone family moved to was a world of its own. The neighborhoods were like territories for different groups, where your last name, your street, and your connections decided your place in society. For a young boy like Tommy, these streets would be both a playground and a place to learn for a life that would later spin far out of control. Even as a child, Tommy showed traits that made people around him nervous. His teachers at his school, PS 273, noticed he could not sit still, that he got angry very quickly, and worst of all, that he did not seem to care about other kids. Fights started on the playground. Tommy did not just join in. He made them so much more violent that it shocked even the tough kids of East New York. Mrs. Catherine Romano, who taught third grade at PS 273 for over 30 years, would later remember Tommy DeSimone as one of the most troubling children she ever met. Most kids, when they got angry, you could talk to them and calm them down. She remembered years later. With Tommy, it was like a switch was flipped. His eyes would look empty, and he'd keep hitting long after the other kid was down and crying. These were not normal childhood fights. By age 8, Tommy was known by local parents as a child to stay away from. He would pick fights with bigger kids and smaller kids. It did not matter. What mattered was the chance to cause pain. Even more troubling was how much he seemed to enjoy these moments of violence. The way his face would light up when he landed a punch or saw blood on his knuckles. The DeSimone house itself was full of stress and unhappiness. Frank DeSimone, Tommy's father, was a man stuck between two worlds. The old country ways his own parents had brought from Sicily, and the American dream that seemed just out of his reach. He worked long, hard hours in construction, came home tired and often drunk, and did not have much patience for a son who seemed to want to cause trouble all the time. Dolores DeSimone tried to be the calm one in the family, but she was not winning. The neighbors' complaints about Tommy's behavior, the calls from school, the more serious pranks he was pulling, all of it tired her out. She would spend hours at St. Fortunata Catholic Church, lighting candles and praying for her son's soul. She felt even then that something was very wrong with the boy. By the time Tommy turned 10, the signs were clear to anyone who wanted to see them. He had been caught herding neighborhood cats, had set fire to a local grocery store's trash can, and had sent another child to the hospital in a fight that could only be called a brutal beating. The other parents in the neighborhood began crossing the street when they saw him coming, and local shop owners would follow him around their stores, knowing deep down that trouble followed Tommy DeSimone wherever he went. The school system tried to help, but in the 1950s, Brooklyn did not have many ways to help troubled children. A school counselor named Mr. Patrick Sullivan spent hours with Tommy, trying to understand what made the boy so angry. What he found worried him a lot. Tommy showed no regret for what he did, had a scary interest in violence, and seemed to see other people not as other humans, but as objects to be used or broken. "I've worked with difficult children for 20 years, Sullivan wrote in a report that would be lost in the messy paperwork. Thomas DeSimone is different. He doesn't just act out. He thinks about it. He watches you, looking for weak spots, and then he attacks. In 30 years of psychology, I've never seen such coldness in someone so young." The religious classes that were required in Tommy's Catholic school seemed to have no effect on him at all. Sister Margaret Mary, who taught religious class at St. Fortunata, would later describe Tommy as a child who listened to stories of saints with the same look he had when watching fights in the schoolyard. Not respect or fear, but interest in the specific details of pain. As Tommy grew into his early teenage years, the violence happened more often and got worse. At 13, he was arrested for the first time. He was caught breaking into a local hardware store, not for money, but for the tools inside. When asked by police, Tommy could not explain why he wanted hammers, knives, and rope. He just said they might be useful someday. The system for young criminals in the early 1960s was not ready to handle someone like Tommy DeSimone. He was too young for real prison, too old for a special school to make much difference, and too dangerous to just let go with a warning. So he was moved between different places for young criminals. Each place taught him new skills, not good skills, but criminal skills. He learned how to pick locks from a car thief, how to sell stolen things from a robber, and most importantly, how to see what people were afraid of and use it against them. By 1965, 15-year-old Tommy DeSimone was a well-known person in the criminal world of East New York. He was not yet connected to any big criminal group, but he was known as someone who could be hired for jobs that needed a special kind of meanness. Store owners who were late on their payments to criminals might find Tommy waiting for them in a dark alley. Gamblers who did not pay their debts might find their car tires cut, their windows broken, Or worse, Dot, it was during this time that Tommy first found the world that would shape the rest of his short, violent life. The world of organized crime. The Lucchese crime family had been working in Brooklyn and Queens for many years, running everything from gambling to controlling unions. They were always looking for young, talented people, especially young men who were not afraid of violence. He was introduced to them by a man in the neighborhood named Paul Vario. Paul Vario Sr. was a captain in the Lucchese family who ran his business from a small cab company in Brownsville. Vario was an old-school kind of criminal, a man who understood that fear was the most important thing in his business. He had heard about the young DeSimone kid, heard about his total lack of a conscience and his love for violence, and he was interested. The first meeting happened on a cold February evening in 1965 behind Vario's cab company. Tommy had been brought there by Joey Manuso, a small-time criminal who sometimes used Tommy for collecting money. Vario was in his 50s then, a heavy-set man with cold eyes and hands that had seen more violence than most people could think of. "So, you're the kid I've been hearing about," Vario said, looking Tommy up and down like he was judging a racehorse. "Joey tells me you have talent." Tommy, barely 16, but already acting with the confidence of someone much older, looked back at Vario without looking away. "I do what needs to be done," he replied. What happened next would become a famous story in the neighborhood. Vario had a problem. Shop owner named Sal Benedetto had been refusing to pay protection money for 3 months. Benedetto thought he could not be touched because his brother-in-law was a detective with the New York Police Department. Vario wanted to send a message, but it had to be quiet enough to not get too much police attention. "Think you can handle something like that?" Vario asked Tommy. Tommy's answer was quick. "When do you want it done?" 3 days later, Sal Benedetto was found in his shop. He was beaten so badly that he spent 2 weeks in the hospital. But the beating was not just random. Violence, it was planned and exact, every bone in. Benedetto's hands was broken, making sure he could not work for months. His face was not touched, so he could not claim police had beaten him. And the message was clear: cross the Lucchese family, and this is what happens to you. More importantly for Tommy's future, the job had been done with a kind of professional meanness that impressed even experienced criminals. Vario heard that the DeSimone kid had not just beaten Benedetto. He had enjoyed it. He had taken his time, made the man suffer, and had walked away whistling. That night, Paul Vario made a choice that would change organized crime in New York for the next 20 years. He called Tommy back to the cab company and offered him regular work, not as a full member, because Tommy wasn't fully Italian, so he could never be a made man, but as a helper, someone who could handle the jobs that even tough mobsters did not like. Tommy accepted right away. For him, this was not just a job, but it was a chance to use his violent side with the protection and help of a big criminal group. No more small money collections or little thefts. Now he would have access to real money, real power, and most importantly, real chances for violence. The first few months working for Vario were like college for Tommy DeSimone. He learned the complex rules of organized crime, a careful mix of violence and talking that kept the money coming in. He discovered that in this world, his crazy side was not a problem. It was a good thing. While other criminals might wait before hurting someone, or might feel bad after a really mean beating, Tommy felt nothing but happiness. It was also during this time that Tommy first met the 2 men who would become his closest partners, and in the end, the ones who saw his downfall. Henry Hill and James "Jimmy the Gent" Burke. Henry Hill was everything Tommy was not. He was charming, smart, and able to think about more than just the next chance for violence. Hill was a few years older than Tommy, and was already one of Vario's most trusted money makers. He ran a betting game, sold stolen things, and had connections all over the criminal world. But Henry had a problem. He was half Irish and half Italian, which meant he could never be a made man in the family. And some of the older mobsters did not fully trust him. Tommy DeSimone, with his pure Italian blood and his reputation for being completely loyal to whoever was paying him, became Henry's perfect partner. Where Henry had the brains and connections, Tommy had the muscle and the ability to scare people. Their partnership would last for over 10 years and would make both men richer than they ever imagined. Jimmy Burke was different from both. Henry and Tommy. Burke was Irish, which automatically kept him from being a member of any Italian crime family. But he had earned respect just by being good at what he did and being mean. Jimmy was a hijacker, a man who specialized in stealing trucks full of goods and then selling the goods through a network of crooked businessmen and mob-connected sellers. Burke saw something in Tommy that even Henry Hill missed. Tommy was not just violent. He was violent in a smart way. He could control his crazy urges long enough to plan difficult jobs, but when it was time for action, he could unleash a level of meanness that would stop anyone in their tracks. In Burke's world of truck hijacking, this mix made Tommy very valuable. The three men, Hill, Burke, and DeSimone, formed a partnership that would control crime in Brooklyn and Queens for the next 15 years. They worked perfectly with each other. Henry's smarts and connections, Jimmy's planning skills and smart thinking, and Tommy's total willingness to do whatever it took to make money and keep power. But even in those early days, there were signs that Tommy DeSimone was different from other criminals. While Henry and Jimmy could separate their work from their fun, Tommy seemed to really enjoy the violent parts of their work. A normal money collection might turn into a brutal beating just because Tommy felt like being violenta. Simple job to scare someone might turn into torture because Tommy wanted to see how much pain he could cause before the person passed out. Other criminals in their group began to notice Tommy's strange habits. He would volunteer for the most violent jobs, not because they paid more, but because he enjoyed them. He kept souvenirs from his victims, a watch here, a wallet there, and sometimes more scary items that he would show off to other criminals, like prizes. Most telling of all, Tommy began to get a reputation for being hard to predict, which made even his closest partners nervous. Henry Hill would later say that working with Tommy was like being partners with a loaded gun that might go off at any moment. Jimmy Burke, who could be very violent himself, admitted that Tommy sometimes scared even him. By 1970, 20-year-old Tommy DeSimone had earned his spot in the Lucchese family ranks. He was making good money, had the respect of serious criminals, and had found the perfect way to use his violent urges. But changing from a troubled teenager to a professional criminal had also let out something darker in Tommy's personality. The violence that used to be random and on a whim was now focused and planned. He was no longer just a street tough looking for fights. He was becoming something much more dangerous. The early 1970s was the time when Tommy DeSimone changed from a promising young criminal to one of the most feared men in New York's criminal world. It was during this time that he earned the nickname that would follow him to his grave, Tommy Two Guns. The name was not given lightly. It came from Tommy's habit of carrying two pistols at all times and his willingness to use both of them at the same time when he needed to. The first event that started to build Tommy's scary reputation happened in the spring of 1970. Tommy, Henry Hill, and Jimmy Burke were doing a hijacking job near John F. Kennedy Airport. targeting trucks, carrying expensive goods. The spot was perfect for their jobs. It was far enough away to avoid a quick police response, but close enough to major highways for fast getaways. On this one night, they had targeted a truck carrying a shipment of Italian leather goods going to fancy stores in Manhattan. The job should have been normal. Stop the truck, threaten the driver, steal the goods, and disappear into the night. But Tommy DeSimone was never happy with normal. The truck driver, a middle-aged man named Frank Torino, made the mistake of trying to fight back instead of just handing over the keys, like most drivers did when faced with armed hijackers. Torino tried to fight. He grabbed a tire iron from his truck and swung it. What happened next became a famous criminal story. Tommy did not just defend himself. He flew into a rage that shocked even his experienced partners. He pulled out both of his pistols and started to hit Torino with them, in a planned and brutal way that was much more than what was needed to stop him. When Henry Hill tried to step in, worried that Tommy might actually kill the man, Tommy turned both guns on his partner. "Nobody stops me when I'm working," Tommy snarled, his eyes showing the dead, shark-like look that would become his signature. Nobody. Torino survived the beating, but he spent 6 months in the hospital and never drove a truck again. More importantly, for Tommy's reputation, the story of what happened spread through the criminal world. Here was a man who would turn on his own partners if they got in the way of his violence. Here was someone who took the already dangerous world of truck hijacking and pushed it into a world of pure meanness. The nickname Tommy Two Guns came from this event, but it was confirmed by a series of shootings that happened over the next 2 years. Unlike other criminals who used guns to scare people, Tommy used them as tools of terror. He did not just shoot people. He shot them many times, often continuing to fire long after they were down. He would stand over his victims, emptying both pistols into their bodies, reloading, and sometimes shooting them again. The mental effect of Tommy's methods was huge. Other criminals began to fear him, not just because he was violent, but because his violence was so extreme that it seemed like he was really mentally unstable. In a world where most criminals were driven by money and power, Tommy seemed to be driven by something darker, a real love of causing pain and death. One event that really helped Tommy's reputation happened at a mob social club in Bensonhurst. Tommy had been drinking with several other criminals when an argument started over a card game. The argument was small. Someone accused someone else of cheating over a $5 bet. In most criminal groups, fights like this were settled with harsh words, or, at most, a short fight. Tommy DeSimone saw it as a chance for violence. Before anyone could step in, Tommy had pulled out both pistols and shot 3 men. None of them died, but all 3 needed a lot of time in the hospital. The shocking part was not just the violence. It was the fact that Tommy had turned a small argument into a triple shooting in just a few seconds, and he had done it with a smile on his face. The event sent shockwaves through the criminal community. Even tough mobsters began to wonder if Tommy DeSimone was too unstable to work with. But Paul Vario saw something different in Tommy's behavior. He saw a man who could be used as the ultimate enforcer, someone so scary that just the threat of sending Tommy after someone would be enough to make them obey. Vario began using Tommy for the most important jobs, collecting money from people who had not been scared by normal methods, talking to rival criminals who needed to be reminded of the Lucchese family's power, and getting rid of people who had become problems for the group. Tommy's reputation grew with every job, and with that reputation came both fear and respect. But Tommy's rise in the criminal ranks came with a cost. His increasing violence began to get attention from the police. NYPD's organized crime unit started a file on Thomas DeSimone, writing down his suspected part in dozens of violent crimes. The FBI began watching him, trying to build a case that would put Tommy away for life. More troubling for Tommy's partners was his growing unpredictability. Violence that was once controlled and had a purpose was becoming random and impulsive. Tommy would beat waiter for bringing him the wrong drink, shoot a parking attendant for asking him to move his car, or torture a loan shark's customer just because he was bored. Henry Hill, who had worked closely with Tommy for several years, began to notice worrying changes in his partner's behavior. Tommy was becoming more and more paranoid, sure that other criminals were plotting against him. He would get angry over the smallest thing, and his calm periods were getting shorter and harder to predict. Tommy was always crazy, Hill would later testify. But in the early 70s, he started getting crazy in a different way. It wasn't just that he was violent. It was that he seemed to be losing control of when and where he was violent. You couldn't predict what would set him off. And once he started, you couldn't stop him. Despite these warning signs, Tommy continued to be valuable to the Lucchese organization. His reputation for extreme violence made him a good way to scare off rivals and enemies. Businessmen who might normally refuse to pay protection money would pay right away when told that Tommy Two Guns would be collecting the money. Criminals who might challenge the scene. Families' power would back down when they learned that Tommy DeSimone was enforcing the rules of their territory. Of all the violent events that built Tommy DeSimone's scary reputation, none was more shocking or more telling of his true nature than what became known as the Spider Incident. This event, which happened at Robert's Lounge in South Ozone Park, Queens, would later be made famous in popular culture. But the real event was much more disturbing than any movie version could show. Robert's Lounge was Jimmy Burke's headquarters, a plain-looking bar that was the center for much of the crew's criminal work. The bar was officially owned by Robert McMahon, but everyone knew that Jimmy Burke was the real power behind it. It was here that the crew planned their hijackings, divided their stolen goods, and celebrated their successful crimes. On a cold December evening in 1970, the usual crowd had gathered at Robert's Lounge. Tommy DeSimone was there, along with Henry Hill, Jimmy Burke, and several other members of their crew. Also, there was a young man named Michael Spider Gianco. He was an 18-year-old kid from the neighborhood who worked at the bar and ran errands for the crew. Spider Junko was everything that Tommy DeSimone had never been as a teenager. Likeable, hard-working, and really trying to make an honest living even. Though he had connections to organized crime. He came from a poor family and saw his job at Robert's Lounge as a way to earn money while staying on the edge of criminal life. He did not want to join the crew. He just wanted to earn enough money to help support his mother and younger brothers and sisters. The incident started as a normal evening of vaudeville, of drinking and telling stories. Crew members were celebrating a successful truck hijacking, and there was a lot of alcohol. Tommy, who had been drinking a lot, was in one of his unpredictable moods. Happy one moment and mean the next, with his feelings changing without warning. Spider was working behind the bar, serving drinks and cleaning glasses. When Tommy decided to make him part of the night's fun. Tommy began ordering Spider around, telling him to dance, to bring drinks faster, and to show proper respect to the criminals who were better than him. The other crew members watched nervously, seeing the signs that Tommy was getting ready to do something violent. "Hey, Spider," Tommy called out, his voice taking on the fake friendly tone that everyone who knew him had learned to fear. "Come over here and dance for us. Show us some moves." Spider, trying to calm the situation down, tried to brush off Tommy's demands with a joke. "Ah, come on, Tommy. I can't dance. I'm a terrible dancer." The answer set off something in Tommy's twisted mind. In his mind, Spider's refusal was not just a polite. No, it was a sign of disrespect. A challenge to his power that he could not allow. Tommy's face changed instantly, the fake friendliness disappearing to show the cold, hungry look that his victims knew all too well. "I said dance," Tommy repeated, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow scarier than any shout. The room fell silent. Everyone there understood what was happening. Tommy was working himself up to violence, and there was probably no way to stop him. Henry Hill would later describe the feeling as like watching a time-bound countdown to zero. Spider, maybe not fully understanding how much danger he was in, continued to try to calm the situation. "Come on, Tommy, I'm working here. Maybe later, okay?" That was the moment Tommy DeSimone snapped. He pulled out one of his pistols and shot Spider in the foot. The gunshot in the small room was very loud. Spider screamed and fell behind the bar, holding his wounded foot as blood poured onto the floor. The other crew members sat frozen, shocked by how sudden and senseless the violence was. But Tommy was not finished. As Spider lay on the floor, crying and begging for help, Tommy began to laugh. It was not the nervous laughter of someone who had done something on impulse that he immediately regretted. It was the real laughter of someone who found the pain of another human being truly funny. "Now you're dancing," Tommy said, putting his gun away and going back to his drink as if nothing had happened. The most disturbing part of the event was not just the violence. It was Tommy's complete lack of concern for Spider's pain, while the other crew members rushed to help the wounded young man. Tommy sat at the bar drinking and sometimes looking over at Spider with what could only be called satisfaction. Spider survived the shooting, but his foot was permanently hurt. He walked with a limp for the rest of his short life, and he lived in constant fear that Tommy might decide to finish what he had started. The event became part of the crew's shared stories, a story that was told and retold as an example of Tommy's unpredictable violence. But the Spider incident was just one of many random acts of violence that Tommy did during this time. His reputation for meanness was built on dozens of similar events, each one more disturbing than the last. That was the night Tommy beat hot dog seller unconscious because the man had run out of mustard. There was the afternoon he hit a parking meter attendant with his pistol for giving him a ticket. There was the evening he tortured a loan shark's customer for 3 hours, not because the man owed money, but because Tommy was bored and wanted some fun. Each event added to Tommy's scary reputation, but they also showed how deep his mental problems were. Other criminals might use violence for money, for respect, or for a smart advantage. Tommy used violence because he enjoyed it. The pain and terror of his victims was not an unlucky side effect of his criminal work. It was the main reason for it. One especially telling event happened during a normal money collection job. Tommy and Henry Hill had been sent to collect a debt from a small-time bookie named Saul Vitali. Vitali owed the Lucchese family $5,000, money he had borrowed to cover gambling losses, but had not been able to pay back on time. The collection should have been simple. Vitali was cooperating, explaining his money problems and suggesting a payment plan that would let him pay off the debt over several months. Henry Hill was ready to accept the plan. It was reasonable, and Vitali had a good reputation for eventually paying his debts. But Tommy DeSimone had other ideas. While Henry was talking with Vitali, Tommy began walking around the bookie's small office, looking at personal photos, opening desk drawers, and handling Vitali's things with the casual disrespect of an animal, marking its territory. "This your wife?" Tommy asked, picking up a framed photograph of Vitali with a middle-aged woman. "Yeah, that's Maria," Vitali replied nervously. "She's pretty." Tommy said Dot, and there was something in his voice that made both Vitali and Henry Hill look up in alarm. What happened next showed the full extent of Tommy's cruel imagination. Instead of just threatening Vitali with physical violence, Tommy began to describe in graphic detail what he would do to Maria Vitali if her husband did not pay the full amount right away. The descriptions were so brutal and so sexual that even Henry Hill, who had seen countless acts of criminal violence, was disgusted. Vitali, terrified for his wife's safety, somehow managed to come up with the full $5,000 that same day. But the event left everyone involved deeply disturbed. Tommy had not just collected a debt. He had used the threat of sexual violence against an innocent woman as a tool to scare someone. It was a level of evil that shocked even hardened criminals. Word of events like these spread through the criminal world, building Tommy's reputation, but also creating a growing feeling of worry among his partners. Other criminals began to wonder if Tommy DeSimone was too unstable to work with safely. Even Paul Vario, who had seen Tommy's violence as a good thing, began to worry that his student was becoming a problem. By 1975, Tommy DeSimone had reached the highest point of his criminal career. At 25 years old, he was earning more money than he had ever thought possible, had the respect and fear of criminals all over New York, and had made himself one of the best enforcers in the Lucchese crime family. But success in the criminal world came with its own problems. Tommy's mental instability was becoming harder and harder to manage. The mid-1970s were great years for organized crime in New York. The city was almost out of money. Police were stretched thin, and there was corruption at all levels of government. For criminals like Tommy, Henry Hill, and Jimmy Burke, it was a perfect situation for making money through hijacking, robbery, extortion, and fraud. Their jobs had become more and more complicated. What had started as simple truck hijackings had grown into complex criminal businesses involving networks of crooked airport workers, dishonest cops, and corrupt politicians. They had inside information on valuable shipments, early warnings of police investigations, and enough political protection to work almost without fear of being caught. Tommy's part in these jobs was important but troubling. He had become the crew's main enforcer, the man they called when someone needed to be scared, beaten, or killed. His reputation for extreme violence made him very good at this job, but it also made him increasingly dangerous to be around. The money was better than Tommy had ever dreamed possible. Successful truck hijacking might get the crew hundreds of thousands of dollars in goods that could be sold through their network of crooked businessmen. A well-planned airport robbery could bring in millions of dollars in cash, jewels, or other expensive items. Tommy's share of these jobs made him rich by any normal standard, but being rich could not satisfy Tommy's deeper mental needs. No amount of money could fill the empty space where his conscience should have been, and no amount of respect could make up for his basic inability to form normal human relationships. As his criminal success grew, his violent habits became more extreme and more unpredictable. It was during this time that Tommy began to develop what his partners would later describe as rituals around his violence. He would spend hours cleaning and taking care of his weapons, talking to them as if they were pets. He kept detailed mental records of everyone he had hurt, killed, or threatened. Looking back on these memories, like other people might look at photo albums. Most disturbing of all, Tommy began to look for chances for violence, even when they were not needed for business. He would volunteer for killing jobs, not because they paid well, but because they gave him a chance to kill. He would turn normal jobs to scare people into torture sessions just because he enjoyed watching people suffer. Henry Hill, who worked closely with Tommy during this time, would later describe the experience as more and more like a nightmare. In the beginning, Tommy was crazy, but he was our crazy, Hill testified. By the mid-70s, he was just crazy. You couldn't control him. You couldn't predict him, and you couldn't trust him not to do something that would bring the police down on all of us. The breaking point came with a series of events that showed just how far Tommy had fallen into pure cruelty. The first happened during what should have been a normal meeting with a crooked airport worker who gave inside information about valuable shipments. The airport worker, a baggage handler named Tony Ragucci, had been selling information to the crew for over 2 years. He was reliable, quiet, and had never caused any problems. But on this one day, Ragucci mentioned that he was thinking about retiring from his job and moving to Florida with his family. To most criminals, this would have been normal business, thanking a reliable source for his work and wishing him well in retirement. But Tommy DeSimone heard something different in Ragucci's words. In his twisted mind, retirement meant that Ragucci might be planning to work with the police. Moving to Florida meant he might be going into the witness protection program. Without warning or talking to his partners, Tommy decided that Tony Ragucci had to die. The murder was done with a level of meanness that shocked even Tommy's hardened partners. Instead of just shooting Ragucci quickly, Tommy tortured him for hours, trying to get him to admit he was working with the police, which was not true. When Ragucci continued to say that he just wanted to retire, Tommy's violence got so bad that Henry Hill would later describe it as beyond anything I had ever seen. The murder solved no problems and created several new ones. Ragucci's disappearance led to a police investigation that brought unwanted attention to the crew's jobs. His replacement at the airport was less reliable and more expensive. Most importantly, other potential informants began to stay away from the crew, afraid that they might be next on Tommy's list of suspected informants. Jimmy Burke, who had always been able to control Tommy's violent urges through a mix of respect and fear, began to lose his power over his increasingly unstable partner. Tommy was no longer happy to take orders or follow plans. He wanted to make things up as he went, to add his own creative touches to their criminal jobs. And those touches always involved unnecessary violence. The situation got worse during the planning stages of what became their most famous crime, the Lufthansa heist at John F. Kennedy Airport. The robbery, which would eventually get the crew over $5 million, required careful planning, exact timing, and above all, no unnecessary violence that might start a major police investigation. Tommy DeSimone had other ideas. The Lufthansa heist of December 11th, 1978 would be remembered as one of the biggest cash robberies in American history, getting the crew over $5 million in cash and almost $1 million in jewelry. But for Tommy DeSimone, the heist was something much more important than money. It was the final result of years of criminal growth and the start of his final, deadly fall into pure madness. The idea for the Lufthansa job was started in early 1978 when Louis Werner, a cargo supervisor at Kennedy Airport, came to Henry Hill with inside information about regular cash shipments. Werner owed a lot of money to loan sharks and desperately needed money to avoid being killed by the people he owed. He knew that Lufthansa German Airlines regularly received large cash shipments from their European business, and he was willing to give detailed information about security rules in exchange for a share of any robbery money. For Jimmy Burke, this was the chance of a lifetime. The Lufthansa Cargo building was like a fortress during regular business hours, but Werner's inside information showed weaknesses that could be used during the night shift. With careful planning and exact action, they could walk away with millions of dollars and disappear before anyone even knew a robbery had happened. But planning the Lufthansa heist meant working with Tommy DeSimone at the peak of his violent instability. By 1978, Tommy's reputation for unpredictable meanness had become so extreme that other criminals were hesitant to work with him, even within their own crew. There were quiet talks about whether Tommy had become too dangerous to trust with big jobs. The planning meetings for Lufthansa happened over several months, mostly at Robert's Lounge and at a safe house in Queens. Jimmy Burke insisted on very careful preparation. Detailed floor plans of the cargo building, careful timing of security guards' rounds, and backup plans for every possible problem. The robbery would only work if every member of the crew followed the plan exactly, with no making things up and absolutely no unnecessary violence. Tommy DeSimone listened to these talks with growing frustration in his mind. Careful planning was for cowards. Real criminals took what they wanted through force and fear, not through complicated plans that relied on being quiet and sneaky. He began pushing for a more aggressive plan. Why sneak into the building when they could just shoot their way in? Why worry about security guards when they could kill them all? Tommy wanted to turn it into a war. Henry Hill would later testify. He kept saying we should go in with machine guns, kill everyone in the building, and take everything that wasn't nailed down. He couldn't understand why we wanted to do it quietly. Burke managed to keep Tommy under control during the planning stages, but it took constant watching and more clear threats. Tommy's part in the heist was carefully limited. He would be part of the team that entered the building, but he would not be in charge of any important decisions. Most importantly, he would not be allowed to carry his usual collection of weapons. Burke insisted that Tommy be armed only with a pistol and that he use it only if absolutely necessary for the crew's escape. These rules made Tommy furious, as he saw them as signs of disrespect and distrust. He began to suspect that Burke and Hill were planning to cheat him out of his full share of the money. His paranoia, which had been growing for months, reached new levels as the date of the heist got closer. The robbery itself went almost exactly as planned. The crew, led by Burke and including Tommy, Henry Hill, and several other carefully chosen criminals, entered the Lufthansa cargo building in the early morning hours of December 11th, 1978. They overpowered the security guards, forced the night supervisor to open the vault, and loaded over $5 million in cash and jewelry into their getaway cars. Tommy's behavior during the heist showed both his value to the crew and the danger he posed to their long-term success. When one of the security guards hesitated to follow orders, Tommy's immediate reaction was to press his pistol against the man's head and begin counting down from 10. The guard quickly obeyed, but Tommy seemed disappointed that he had not been given a reason to pull the trigger. More troubling was Tommy's reaction to the huge amount of money they found in the vault. While the other crew members focused on efficiently loading the cash into their bags, Tommy seemed overwhelmed by the sight of so much money. He began laughing wildly, filling his pockets with loose bills and talking about all the people he could kill with his share of the money. Tommy was like a kid in a candy store, one of the other crew members would later remember. But instead of candy, he was thinking about bullets and bodies. The crew escaped from the cargo building without any problems, and the robbery was not discovered until several hours later. By the time police arrived at the scene, the robbers had vanished into the huge criminal world of New York, leaving behind only confused security guards and an empty vault. in the days right after the heist. Tommy's share of the money made him richer than he had ever been in his life. But being rich only made his existing mental problems worse. Instead of enjoying his new riches, Tommy became more and more paranoid about other people trying to steal from him. He began carrying even more weapons than usual and started seeing potential threats everywhere he looked. More disturbing was Tommy's understanding of the heist's success in his mind. The robbery had worked not because of careful planning and teamwork, but because of his willingness to threaten violence against the security guards. He began to believe that he had been the real leader of the job and that Burke and Hill had simply followed his lead. This false belief set the stage for the fights that would ultimately lead to Tommy's downfall. He began demanding a larger share of future jobs, insisting that what he did was more valuable than what his partners did. He started making decisions without talking to Burke or Hill, doing things that increased the risk of police finding out and charging them. Most dangerous of all, Tommy began to see his partners not as friends, but as potential rivals who might be planning to kill him. His paranoia reached levels that made normal criminal teamwork impossible, and his violent reactions to what he thought were insults became more and more extreme. The months after the Lufthansa heist should have been a time of celebration and careful money management for the crew that had pulled off one of the biggest robberies in American history. Instead, it became a time of growing paranoia, increasing violence, and growing mistrust that would eventually destroy the criminal group that Jimmy Burke had spent decades building. Problems began almost immediately after the robbery, even though Jimmy Burke had given clear instructions that crew members should avoid flashy purchases that might get police attention. Several people in the heist began spending their money in ways that were impossible to ignore. New cars, expensive jewelry, fancy vacations, all bought by men who had never had legal ways of making money that could explain such spending. Tommy DeSimone's spending spree was especially reckless. Within weeks of the heist, he had bought a new Cadillac, a wardrobe of expensive suits, and a collection of high-end weapons that included several illegal automatic pistols. More troubling was his habit of showing off large amounts of cash in public, paying for meals and drinks with $100 bills, and bragging about his new wealth to anyone who would listen. Burke was furious about these security mistakes, but his attempts to control his crew members' behavior were met with more and more resistance. Tommy, in particular, seemed to think Burke's warnings were attempts to cheat him out of his fair share of the money. The mutual respect and fear that had once kept Tommy in line began to fade, replaced by suspicion and barely hidden anger. The paranoia that gripped the crew was fed by real concerns about a police investigation. The Lufthansa heist had been front-page news across the country, and police departments at all levels were under intense pressure to solve the case. FBI agents were watching suspected criminals all over New York, and several crew members reported being followed by unmarked police cars. Tommy's paranoia went far beyond reasonable concerns about the police. He began to suspect that other crew members were planning to kill him to reduce the number of people who could potentially testify against them. He started carrying even more weapons than usual, sleeping in different places each night, and avoiding his usual spots where potential killers might be waiting. More disturbing was Tommy's growing belief that Henry Hill and Jimmy Burke were actively plotting against him. In Tommy's twisted mind, every private conversation between his partners was proof of a plot. Every decision made without talking to him was a sign of disrespect, and every suggestion that he change his behavior was an attempt to weaken him before he was eventually betrayed. This paranoia showed itself in increasingly wild and violent behavior. Tommy began confronting other crew members about imagined insults, demanding explanations for perfectly innocent actions, and threatening violence against anyone he suspected of not being loyal. The criminal group that had once worked smoothly under Burke's leadership began to fall apart under the pressure of Tommy's suspicions and accusations. The situation reached a breaking point in early 1979, when Tommy's paranoia led him to commit a murder that would ultimately seal his own fate. The victim was Ronald "Foxy" Jareth, a small-time criminal who had worked with the crew on several occasions, but had never been part of their inner circle. Jareth's crime, in Tommy's mind, was simple. He had been asking too many questions about the Lufthansa heist. In reality, Jareth's curiosity was probably nothing more than the natural interest that any criminal would have in such a big robbery. But Tommy saw these questions as proof that Jareth was gathering information for the police. The murder of Foxy Jareth was carried out with the planned meanness that had become Tommy's signature. Instead of just shooting Jareth quickly, Tommy tortured him for hours, trying to get him to admit he was working with the police, which was almost certainly not true. When Jareth continued to insist that he was just curious about the heist, Tommy's violence got so bad that it shocked even his hardened partners. The murder solved no problems and created several serious new ones. Jareth's disappearance led to a police investigation that brought more attention to the crew's activities. More importantly, the senseless meanness of the killing showed that Tommy DeSimone had moved beyond the limits of acceptable criminal behavior, even by the standards of organized crime. Jimmy Burke, who had always been able to justify Tommy's violence as a necessary tool of their criminal work, began to realize that his longtime partner had become a serious problem. Tommy's unpredictable behavior was putting the whole group in danger, and his paranoid suspicions were making normal criminal teamwork impossible. The final straw came when Tommy began making threats against Henry Hill, his longtime partner and friend. Tommy had convinced himself that Hill was planning to testify against him in exchange for a shorter prison sentence, and he started talking about killing Hill before that could happen. For Burke, this was unacceptable. Henry Hill was too valuable to the group to be sacrificed to Tommy's paranoid ideas. Also, Hill's murder would bring even more police attention to their activities at a time when they were already being watched closely. Because of the Lufthansa investigation, Burke made the decision that would end Tommy DeSimone's criminal career and eventually his life. Tommy had become too dangerous to work with and too unstable to trust with the secrets of their criminal group. He would have to be killed. The year 1979 began with Tommy DeSimone at what seemed to be the highest point of his criminal career. He was rich, feared throughout the New York criminal world, and still considered a valuable person by the Lucchese crime family. But under the surface, the mental demons that had pushed Tommy's rise were now pushing him toward a fall that would be as big as it was certain to happen. The warning signs were clear to anyone who knew how to see them. Tommy's behavior had become more and more wild, even by his own extreme standards. He was sleeping only a few hours each night, constantly watching for enemies who were mostly in his own paranoid mind. His once planned approach to violence had turned into random acts of meanness that had no smart purpose and created unnecessary risks for everyone around him. Most troubling of all, Tommy had begun to turn his suspicions on the very people who had made his criminal career possible. He was openly questioning Jimmy Burke's leadership, challenging Henry Hill's loyalty, and making threats against other crew members who had worked with him for years. Bonds of mutual trust and shared crime that held Their group together were being eaten away by Tommy's paranoid ideas. The first major event of 1979 happened in February, when Tommy's paranoia led him to attack a longtime partner over an imagined insult. The victim was Vinny Asaro, a connected guy who had worked with their crew on several successful hijacking jobs. Asaro had made the mistake of mentioning to another criminal that he thought Tommy was losing his mind, a comment that eventually got back to Tommy through the criminal world's gossip network. Tommy's response was immediate and cruel. He attacked Asaro outside a restaurant in Brooklyn, beating him unconscious with a baseball bat before the man could even defend himself. Attack was so brutal that Asaro spent 3 weeks in the hospital and was never again able to work in the physically hard world of truck hijacking. But the Asaro beating was more than just another example of Tommy's violence. It was a direct challenge to the criminal ranks that ruled their world. Asaro was a respected member of another crime family, and his beating could not be ignored as the usual violence that sometimes happened between rivals. Tommy had attacked someone under the protection of the Bonanno family, creating the possibility of a war between criminal groups. Jimmy Burke was forced to step in, using his connections and talking skills to prevent the Asaro beating from turning into a bigger fight. But the event made it clear that Tommy DeSimone was no longer just a problem for their crew. He was becoming a threat to the entire criminal world in which they worked. The situation got worse as spring turned to summer. Tommy's drug use, which had always been a problem, got so bad that it made him even more unpredictable. He was using cocaine regularly, alcohol constantly, and speed whenever he needed to stay awake for long periods of paranoid watching. The mix of drugs, lack of sleep, and underlying mental illness created a mental cocktail that made clear thinking nearly impossible. Henry Hill, who had worked more closely with Tommy than anyone else, began to fear for his own safety. Tommy's accusations of not being loyal were becoming more specific and more threatening. He had started following Hill around, convinced that his longtime partner was meeting secretly with police agents. On several occasions, Tommy had walked up to Hill with his hand on his gun, ready to shoot based on suspicions that existed only in his own twisted mind. Tommy was gone by the summer of '79. Hill would later testify. He wasn't the same person I had worked with for 10 years. It was like something had broken inside his head, and now he was just a dangerous animal that happened to look like someone I used to know. The breaking point came in September 1979 with an event that showed just how far Tommy had fallen from criminal professionalism into pure madness. The event involved a normal collection job that should have been handled quickly and quietly, but instead became a bloodbath that put the entire crew's security in danger. The target was a small-time bookie named Eddie Granado, who owed the Lucchese family $15,000 in gambling debts. Granado was a reliable customer who had always paid his debts eventually, but he had fallen behind on his payments because of a series of bad bets. A collection job was supposed to be a simple reminder: show up, make it clear that payment was expected soon, and leave without causing any unnecessary problems. Tommy DeSimone had other plans. Instead of following the standard collection process, Tommy decided to make an example of Granado that would scare other debtors from falling behind on their payments. He kidnapped Granado from his home, took him to an abandoned warehouse in Queens, and began to torture him for information about other bookies who might be potential targets for robbery. The torture session lasted for over 6 hours. Tommy used methods he had learned from other criminals and perfected through years of violence: electric shocks, burning, and planned beating of nerve spots. designed to cause the most pain without immediately causing death. He forced Granado to give up the names and addresses of other bookies, the places where they kept their money, and detailed information about their security. When Tommy was finally finished with his victim, he had gotten enough information to potentially rob a dozen other criminal operations, but he had also created a huge security problem that threatened to expose the entire crew to police. Granado knew the names of everyone who worked for the Lucchese family's gambling operations, and his disappearance would definitely start a police investigation. Worse yet, Tommy seemed to have no understanding of the problems he had created. When he finally called Jimmy Burke to report on the collection job, he was proud of the information he had gotten, and confused by Burke's angry response. In Tommy's mind, he had turned a normal debt collection into a major intelligence-gathering operation that would help the entire group. Burke's reaction was explosive. Had spent decades building a criminal group that worked through careful planning and smart thinking, and Tommy's reckless violence was threatening to destroy everything he had worked to create. The two men had a screaming argument that was heard all over Robert's lounge, with Burke making it clear that Tommy's behavior was no longer acceptable. But Tommy saw Burke's anger as proof of the plot he had long suspected. In his paranoid view of the world, Burke was not concerned about security problems or police investigations. He was jealous of Tommy's initiative and was looking for a reason to get rid of a potential rival. From that moment on, Tommy DeSimone was a walking dead man. He had made himself too dangerous to his own criminal group to be allowed to live, but he was also too knowledgeable about their operations to be simply kicked out of the crew. The only solution was to kill him, and Jimmy Burke began making the careful plans that would end Tommy's life. The final months of Tommy DeSimone's life were a downward spiral of paranoia, violence, and loneliness that cut him off from the criminal world that had been his entire adult life. By the fall of 1979, Tommy had become a man living on borrowed time, surrounded by enemies, both real and imagined. His once great network of criminal friends was down to a few partners who were themselves beginning to question their loyalty to an increasingly unstable partner. A change was visible to anyone who saw Tommy. During this time, the confident, swaggering criminal who had once commanded respect through pure force of personality had been replaced by a nervous, twitchy man who jumped at shadows and saw plots in every casual conversation. He had lost weight from stress and drug use. His once perfect appearance had become messy, and his eyes had taken on the wild, unfocused look of someone living on the edge of a complete mental breakdown. Tommy's loneliness was mostly his own fault, the result of his growing belief that everyone around him was planning his destruction. He stopped going to Robert's lounge, the center of his criminal world, for over a decade, because he believed that Jimmy Burke was using the bar as a base for watching him. He avoided his usual restaurants and clubs because he was convinced that other crew members were watching these places, gathering information for a planned killing. Most tragically, Tommy began to turn against the few people who might have been able to help him through the crisis he had created. Henry Hill, who had been Tommy's closest friend and most reliable partner for over 10 years, found himself facing more and more hostile questions about his actions and loyalty. Tommy would show up unexpectedly at Hill's home or workplace, demanding explanations for perfectly innocent activities and making thinly veiled threats against Hill's family. Tommy was like a rabid dog in those last few months. Hill would later recall, "You couldn't reason with him. You couldn't calm him down, and you couldn't predict what he might do next. Every conversation felt like it might be the one that made him start shooting." The few criminal partners who still kept in touch with Tommy reported that he had become obsessed with what he called the betrayal. His belief that Burke, Hill, and others were planning to kill him to protect themselves from police investigation. He would spend hours analyzing past conversations for hidden meanings, looking for clues that confirmed his suspicions. Every decision made without talking to him was proof of a plot. Every suggestion that he calmed down was proof of their plan to weaken him before the kill. Tommy's response to these imagined threats was typically violent and unhelpful. Instead of trying to rebuild the relationships that might have saved his life, he chose to make the fight worse through fear and threats. He began carrying a collection of weapons wherever he went. Multiple pistols, knives, brass knuckles, and even a sawed-off shotgun that he kept in his car for emergencies. More dangerously, Tommy started making specific threats against the people he suspected of plotting against him. He told several partners that he was planning to kill Henry Hill before Hill could testify against him. He made similar threats against Jimmy Burke, even though Burke had connections to powerful people in organized crime who would certainly get revenge on anyone who harmed him. These threats were more than just the ramblings of a paranoid mind. They were real information that Burke and Hill could not ignore. Both men had spent their entire adult lives in a world where threats were promises and paranoia was often proven right. They understood that Tommy DeSimone was completely capable of carrying out his threats, and they could not afford to wait to see if he would actually do it. The decision to kill Tommy was made sometime in November 1979, though the exact date and details of that decision are still a mystery. What is known is that Jimmy Burke, after talking with higher-ranking members of the Lucchese crime family, decided that Tommy DeSimone had become too dangerous to be allowed to live. The irony was deep. Tommy's paranoid belief that his partners were planning to kill him had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. By acting as if he was already at war with his criminal group, he had made that war happen. His threats and violent behavior had turned what might have been manageable fights into a life-or-death struggle that could only end with his death. Burke's planning for Tommy's killing was typically thorough and well-thought-out. He could not simply have Tommy shot in the street. Such a public killing would bring unwanted police attention and might start revenge from Tommy's remaining friends. Instead, the killing would have to look like it was the result of Tommy's own reckless behavior, perhaps a deal gone wrong, or a fight with rival criminals. The challenge was getting Tommy to lower his guard long enough for the killing to be done. His paranoia had made him extremely hard to get close to, and his collection of weapons meant that any confrontation would likely turn into a gunfight that could leave multiple people dead. Burke needed to find a way to trick Tommy into a situation where he could be killed quickly and quietly without creating more problems for the group. The solution came from Tommy's own mind. Despite his paranoid suspicions, Tommy still wanted the respect and recognition that had driven his entire criminal career. He wanted to believe that his longtime partners still valued what he did and were willing to include him in major criminal jobs. This desire for acceptance would eventually provide the opening that Burke needed to carry out his plan. The morning of January 14th, 1979 began like any other day in Thomas DeSimone's increasingly lonely and paranoid life. He woke up in a different apartment than he had slept in the night before, part of his security routine designed to make him harder to track and kill. He checked his collection of weapons, counted his money, and began the careful process of planning another day of survival in what he saw as a hostile world filled with enemies and plots. Tommy had no way of knowing that this would be the last day of his life, or that the detailed security plans he had developed over the past months would be completely useless against the careful planning of his former partners. The trap that Woody and his life had been set weeks earlier, and every detail had been carefully planned to use Tommy's mental weaknesses and desperate need for acceptance from his criminal. Friends doubt the call came in the early afternoon while Tommy was having lunch in a small Italian restaurant in Queens, where he felt relatively safe from being watched. The caller was Henry Hill, his longtime partner and an increasingly frequent target of his paranoid suspicion. But Hill's voice had none of the stress and fear that had been in their recent talks. Instead, he sounded relaxed, friendly, almost like the old days when they had worked together as equals in Jimmy Burke's crew. "Tommy, I got something big," Hill said, his voice carrying the excitement that always came with news of a major criminal opportunity. "Jimmy wants to meet with you tonight. There's a job coming up, something that could make us all rich enough to retire." In his paranoid state, Tommy's first thought was suspicion. For months, he had been convinced that Hill and Burke were plotting against him, and any invitation to meet could be a trap designed to trick him into an attack. But Hill seemed to know about these concerns, addressing them before Tommy could even say what he was thinking. "Look, I know things have been weird between all of us lately," Hill continued, "but Jimmy realizes he made a mistake. He knows you're the best guy we got for jobs that require real guts, and he wants to make things right. This job is so big that he needs everyone working together." The details Hill gave were very tempting. A shipment of cash and jewelry that would be unprotected for a short period of time. Inside information from a crooked airport worker with potential profits in the millions of dollars. It was exactly the kind of major criminal job that had made their crew rich and respected all over the New York criminal world. More importantly, Hill's invitation seemed to offer Tommy what he had been desperately looking for: recognition of his value to the group and an end to the loneliness that had been eating away at his mental health. Despite his suspicions, Tommy found himself wanting to believe that his longtime partners had realized their mistake and were ready to welcome him back into the group. The secret meeting was set for 9 p.m. at a house in Queens that Tommy had never visited before. Hill explained that the location was chosen for security reasons. It was owned by a trusted partner who had no known connections to their crew, making it unlikely that police would be watching it. Tommy would meet Burke and Hill there, get detailed information about the planned job, and begin planning the operation that would give him back his position in the criminal ranks. Tommy spent the afternoon preparing for the meeting with the same careful planning that had kept him alive during months of paranoid watchfulness. He checked and cleaned his weapons, making sure that his 2 pistols were loaded and easy to reach. He planned multiple routes to the meeting location, identifying escape routes and backup spots in case the meeting turned out to be a trap. He even arranged for a partner to check on him if he did not return by a certain time. But despite these plans, Tommy's desperation for acceptance and his craving for the excitement of major criminal work had clouded his usually sharp survival instincts. The mental loneliness of the past months had worn down his defenses, making him easy to trick in, exactly the way that Burke and Hill were using as evening came. Tommy began his journey to what he believed would be a planning meeting for the job of a lifetime. He drove through the familiar streets of Queens, taking a winding route designed to spot any surveillance, stopping sometimes to see if other cars were following him. His paranoid carefulness had become so normal that he kept these security steps, even when he was convinced that the meeting was real. The house where the meeting was scheduled was a plain 2-story building in a working-class neighborhood. just like dozens of other homes on the same street. There were lights on inside, and Tommy could see shadows moving behind the curtains, a sign that other people were already there waiting for him. For a brief moment, his paranoid instincts came back, warning him that something about the situation was not right. But the need for acceptance proved stronger than the voice of caution. Tommy parked his car across the street from the house, checked his weapons one final time, and walked to the front door. He knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more, a prearranged signal that Hill had given him to identify himself to whoever was inside. The door was opened by a man Tommy did not recognize. A tall, thin person with cold eyes who stepped aside to let Tommy enter without speaking. The inside of the house was dimly lit, with heavy curtains drawn across all the windows to prevent anyone outside from seeing what was happening inside. Jimmy Burke was waiting in the living room, sitting in an armchair with a drink in his hand. He looked up when Tommy entered and smiled, the same confident, hungry smile that Tommy had seen thousands of times over the years of their partnership. For a moment, it seemed like nothing had changed between them, like the months of fighting and suspicion had been nothing more than a misunderstanding between old friends. "Tommy, good to see you," Burke said, getting up from his chair and holding out his hand to greet him. "Glad you could make it. We got a lot to discuss." But as Tommy moved forward to shake Burke's hand, his survival instincts finally kicked in. Something about Burke's manner was wrong. Too friendly, too relaxed, too much like a show put on for an audience. Tommy's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon, but it was already too late. The man who had opened the door was now behind him, and Tommy felt the cold metal of a gun barrel pressed against the base of his skull. At the same moment, another armed man came out of the kitchen, blocking Tommy's escape toward the front door. He was trapped in a room with at least 3 armed men, all of whom were positioned to kill him before he could draw his own weapons. "Easy, Tommy," Burke said, his voice still carrying that fake friendliness that Tommy now recognized as the tone of a predator getting ready to strike. No need for anyone to get excited here, but Tommy knew that he was going to. After months of paranoid waiting for exactly this situation, he found himself strangely calm. The fear and desperation that had filled his thoughts for so long were replaced by a cold, analytical check of his situation. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and positioned exactly where his enemies wanted him to be. "You set me up," Tommy said, his voice carrying more sadness than anger. Despite his paranoid suspicions, part of him had continued to hope that his longtime partners might find a way to solve their problems without violence. "You set yourself up," Burke replied. "And now," his voice had none of its earlier fake warmth, "you became a problem, Tommy. You couldn't control yourself. You couldn't be trusted, and you were putting all of us at risk. This is just business. What happened next remains a mystery. No one who was present in that house on January 14th, 1979, ever gave a detailed story of Thomas DeSimone's final moments. What is known is that Tommy DeSimone entered that house alive and never came out. Body was never found. His car was left behind and later found by police. And he simply vanished from the world as completely as if he had never existed. The disappearance of Thomas DeSimone on January 14th, 1979, created a mystery that has interested crime historians, police investigators, and popular culture fans for over 4 decades. Unlike many organized crime murders where the basic facts eventually come out through witness stories or physical evidence, Tommy's killing was carried out with such professional skill that almost no reliable information about the specific details has ever become public. What makes the mystery especially interesting is not just the fact that Tommy's body is missing, organized, Crime figures are gotten rid of permanently pretty regularly. But it's the complete silence that has surrounded the case. In a criminal world, where secrets are often traded for shorter sentences, and former partners regularly testify against each other, the details of Tommy DeSimone's murder have remained locked away. This suggests that his killing involved people with enough power and influence to make sure that witnesses would never feel safe breaking their silence. The most widely accepted theory, supported by Henry Hill's later testimony and FBI investigations, is that Tommy's murder was ordered by James "Jimmy the Gent" Burke, in discussion with higher-ranking members of the Lucchese crime family. According to this version of events, Tommy's increasingly wild behavior and his threats against other crew members had made him too dangerous to be allowed to live. Burke's reason for ordering the killing would have been both personal and professional. On a personal level, Tommy's paranoid accusations and threats had made their long-time partnership impossible to continue. But more importantly, from a business point of view, Tommy's unpredictable violence was attracting unwanted police attention at a time when the crew was already under intense watch because of the Lufthansa heist. Professional skill with which Tommy's killing was carried out certainly shows the signs of Burke's careful planning. The use of a fake meeting to trick Tommy into a controlled place, the careful choice of a location that could be cleaned up after the murder, and the complete disposal of the body all suggest the kind of detailed preparation that Burke brought to his most serious criminal jobs. But some investigators have suggested that the decision to kill Tommy may have come from even higher up in the Lucchese family ranks. Tommy's violence had gone beyond the limits of acceptable criminal behavior, even by organized crime standards. His torture and murder of Ronald "Foxy" Jareth, his unprovoked attack on Vinny Asaro, and his threats against multiple family partners had created problems that went far beyond Jimmy Burke's crew. Paul Vario, the captain who had originally brought Tommy into the group, may have decided that his former student had become a problem that threatened the family's entire operation. Vario had built his power base through careful development of political and police connections, and Tommy's headline-grabbing violence was exactly the kind of attention that could destroy those relationships. According to this theory, Vario would have given Burke permission, or perhaps even clear orders to kill Tommy before his behavior could cause even more serious problems for the group. The murder would have been seen not as a betrayal of a longtime partner, but as a necessary business decision to protect the family's interests. More complex theory suggests that Tommy's killing may have been connected to his knowledge of the Lufthansa heist. As one of the people in the robbery, Tommy had information that could potentially point to dozens of other criminals if he were ever arrested, and decided to work with the police. His increasingly unstable behavior made him an unacceptable security risk, someone who might reveal sensitive information either on purpose or by accident. This theory is supported by the pattern of murders that followed the Lufthansa heist. Over the months after the robbery, several participants and partners were killed, apparently to reduce the number of people who could potentially testify about the crime. Tommy's murder could have been part of this larger cleanup operation, designed to make sure that the secrets of the heist died with the people who knew them. But perhaps the most interesting theory about Tommy's murder involves the possibility that it was ordered by members of other crime families who had been affected by his violence. Tommy's attack on Vinny Asaro, who was connected to the Bonanno family, had created the potential for a war between criminal groups. His torture of various victims had similarly affected people with connections to other families. According to this theory, representatives of multiple crime families may have approached the Lucchese leadership with demands that Tommy DeSimone be killed before his behavior could cause more problems. Faced with the possibility of a larger criminal fight, the Lucchese family would have had little choice but to sacrifice Tommy to keep peace with their criminal neighbors. This explanation would explain the professional skill of Tommy's killing and the complete silence that has surrounded the case. If his murder was approved by multiple crime families, the number of powerful people with an interest in keeping the details secret would make any potential witnesses very hesitant to come forward. A fourth theory, less widely accepted but supported by some evidence, suggests that Tommy's killing may have been connected to his involvement in murders that went beyond his immediate criminal circle. Tommy's violence had claimed victims all over New York's criminal world, and some of these victims may have had connections to powerful people who demanded payback. The murder of Ronald Foxy Jareth, in particular, may have led to demands for revenge from Jareth's partners. While Jareth himself was a small-time criminal without important connections, his killing in such a brutal way may have been seen as an insult to the entire criminal community. Tommy's torture and murder of Jareth showed a level of cruel sadism that broke even the violent rules of organized crime. According to this theory, Tommy's murder was not just a business decision designed to get rid of a problem, but it was an act of revenge demanded by people who had been affected by his violence. The message would have been clear. Even in the violent world of organized crime, there were lines that could not be crossed without consequences. While the exact details of Tommy DeSimone's murder may never be fully known, the available evidence strongly suggests that James the Gent Burke played a central role in planning and carrying out the killing. Burke had both the reason and the ability to carry out such a complex job, and his later behavior provided more evidence of his involvement. Burke's reason for killing Tommy was complex and strong. On a personal level, their relationship had broken down beyond repair. Tommy's paranoid accusations and threats had made continued partnership impossible, and Burke had decided that Tommy was a direct threat to his own survival. The two men who had worked together successfully for over a decade had become enemies, and in the world of organized crime, such fights usually ended with one person killing the other. From a business point of view, Tommy had become an unacceptable problem for Burke's criminal operations. His unpredictable violence was attracting police attention at the worst possible time, the months after the Lufthansa heist, when the crew needed to keep a low profile while the investigation continued. Tommy's high-profile crimes and reckless behavior were exactly the kind of activities that could lead police directly to the rest of the crew. Most importantly, Tommy's threats against Henry Hill had crossed a line that Burke could not ignore. Hill was too valuable to Burke's group to be sacrificed. Tommy's paranoid ideas, Hill's intelligence, connections, and ability to make money made him impossible to replace, while Tommy's contributions to the crew had become overshadowed by the problems he created. Burke's method of killing Tommy was consistent with his approach to other complex criminal jobs. Instead of simply having Tommy shot in the street, Burke planned a detailed trick designed to trick his target into a controlled place where the murder could be carried out safely and the body could be gotten rid of completely. Use of a fake criminal opportunity to trick Tommy to his death was psychologically brilliant. Burke understood that Tommy's desperate need for acceptance and recognition would overcome his paranoid caution if the offer seemed good enough. By presenting the killing as a business meeting for a major job, Burke used Tommy's deepest mental weaknesses. The timing of Tommy's murder also supports Burke's involvement. The killing happened at a moment when Tommy's behavior had become unbearable, but before he could carry out his threats against other crew members. This timing suggests careful planning and strategic thinking, exactly the kind of methodical approach that characterized Burke's most successful criminal jobs. Perhaps most tellingly, Burke's behavior in the months after Tommy's disappearance was consistent with someone who had planned and carried out a complex murder. He showed no surprise at Tommy's absence, asked no questions about what might have happened to his longtime partner, and made no effort to investigate Tommy's disappearance. This lack of curiosity about the fate of a close criminal partner was highly unusual and suggested he knew something. He also took immediate steps to take control of the criminal operations that Tommy had been involved in, giving Tommy's responsibilities to other crew members and taking over his sources of income. This quick reorganization suggested that Burke had been planning for Tommy's killing well before the actual murder. The killing of Tommy DeSimone was followed by a systematic cleanup operation designed to get rid of all evidence of the murder and make sure that potential witnesses would never feel safe coming forward with information. This cover-up was carried out with the same professional skill that had marked the murder itself, suggesting that Burke and his partners had planned not just the killing, but also what would happen after. The first priority was the complete disposal of Tommy's body. Unlike many organized crime murders, where bodies are simply hidden and eventually found by police, Tommy's remains were gotten rid of so completely that they have never been found despite decades of searching by police. This level of thoroughness required significant resources and skill. According to some theories, Tommy's body was disposed of through connections to legitimate businesses that could earn organic material without attracting attention. The New York area in 1979 had numerous industrial facilities, rendering plants, crematoriums, steel mills, and chemical plants that could completely destroy human remains if the operators could be bribed or forced to cooperate. Alternative theories suggest that Tommy's body was disposed of through more traditional organized crime methods: burial in a remote location, dissolving in acid, or disposal at sea. But the fact that no trace of the body has ever been found suggests that whatever method was used was both effective and permanent. The second phase of the cover-up involved getting rid of potential witnesses and silencing anyone who might have information about the murder. This process began immediately after Tommy's killing and continued for months. Afterward, several people who had been close to Tommy or who might have had knowledge of the circumstances surrounding his disappearance were themselves killed in the months after his murder. These secondary killings served both to tie up loose ends and to send a message to other potential witnesses about the consequences of cooperating with the police. The pattern of these follow-up murders was consistent with Burke's methodical approach to problem solving. Each killing was carefully planned and professionally done, with the victims disappearing as completely as Tommy himself had vanished. The message was clear. Anyone who might be tempted to provide information about Tommy's murder would suffer the same fate. Perhaps most importantly, the cover-up involved maintaining absolute silence about the circumstances of Tommy's killing. Unlike many organized crime murders where details eventually came out through witness testimony or physical evidence, the specifics of Tommy's death remained locked away. This silence was maintained through a combination of fear, loyalty, and the strategic killing of potential witnesses. The success of this cover-up can be measured by the fact that more than 4 decades after Tommy's murder, police still have no physical evidence connecting specific people to the crime. While investigators are confident about who was responsible for the murder, they have never been able to build a case that could be prosecuted based on hard evidence. The wall of silence that had protected the secrets of Tommy DeSimone's murder began to crack in 1980 when Henry Hill was arrested on drug charges and faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. Faced with multiple federal charges and the possibility of being killed by his former partners, Hill made the decision that would turn him from a criminal into a witness, and in doing so, would finally bring some of Tommy's story to light. Hill's decision to cooperate with federal investigators was motivated by a pure desire to survive. He had watched as other members of his crew were systematically killed in the months after the Lufthansa heist, and he correctly understood that his own killing was probably going to happen by becoming a government witness. Hill hoped to trade his knowledge of organized crime for protection and a shorter prison sentence. The information that Hill provided to FBI agents and federal prosecutors was amazing in its size and detail. Over the course of dozens of interview sessions, he revealed the inner workings of Jimmy Burke's criminal organization, provided detailed accounts of major crimes, including the Lufthansa heist, and described the violent culture that had produced killers like Tommy DeSimone. Hill's testimony about Tommy was especially valuable to investigators because it provided the first full account of Tommy's criminal career from someone who had worked closely with him for over a decade. Hill described Tommy's change from a promising young criminal to a psychopathic killer, his role in dozens of violent crimes, and the circumstances that had led to his eventual killing. But Hill's cooperation came with big limits. While he was willing to testify about Tommy's crimes and provide general information about his disappearance, Hill claimed to have no direct knowledge of the specific circumstances of Tommy's murder. According to Hill, he had been deliberately left out of the planning and carrying out of Tommy's killing precisely because Burke and other plotters knew that Hill might eventually become a government witness. This limit in Hill's testimony meant that while investigators gained an amazing look into Tommy's criminal activities, they still lacked the specific evidence needed to prosecute anyone for his murder. Hill could describe Tommy's violent behavior, explain why his killing had become necessary, and identify the people who had probably been responsible, but he could not provide the detailed first-hand testimony that would be required for successful prosecutions. Despite these limits, Hill's cooperation was a turning point in law enforcement's understanding of Tommy DeSimone's life and death. For the first time, investigators had access to reliable information about Tommy's criminal activities, his mental decline, and the criminal reasons that had led to his killing. Hill's testimony also provided important context for understanding Tommy's place in the broader history of organized crime in New York. Tommy was not just an isolated psychopath who happened to be connected to organized crime. He was a product of a specific criminal culture that rewarded violence, valued loyalty above all else, and killed anyone who became too dangerous to be allowed to live. The transformation of Tommy DeSimone from an unknown criminal to a cultural icon began in 1990 when director Martin Scorsese released Goodfellas, a film based on Henry Hill's experiences in organized crime. The movie, which starred Ray Liotta as Hill, Robert De Niro as Jimmy Burke, and Joe Pesci as Tommy DeSimone, brought the story of this criminal crew to general audiences around the world. Scorsese's portrayal of Tommy DeSimone, renamed Tommy DeVito in the film, was based on Henry Hill's descriptions of his former partner, but was made less extreme for popular audiences. While the movie showed Tommy as violent and unpredictable, it could not fully capture the extent of his psychopathic behavior without creating a character so disturbing that audiences would be unable to watch. Joe Pesci's Oscar-winning performance created a version of Tommy that was both menacing and charming. A character who could be genuinely frightening in one scene and almost likable in the next. This portrayal, while based on real events, was a big difference from the Tommy DeSimone that Hill had actually known. A man whose violence was far more extreme and whose mental problems were far deeper than any movie character could realistically show. The film's most famous scene, based on the spider incident at Robert's Lounge, perfectly captured both the power and the limits of Hollywood's treatment of Tommy's story. In the movie, Tommy's shooting of Spider seems to be a sudden act caused by the young man's disrespectful response to Tommy's demands. The scene is shocking and memorable, but it presents Tommy's violence as understandable, almost logical, within the world of organized crime culture. The real spider incident, as described by Hill and other witnesses, was far more disturbing. Tommy's violence was not caused by disrespect. It was motivated by a cruel desire to cause pain and terror for its own sake. The systematic torture that Tommy inflicted on his victims, his obvious enjoyment of their suffering, and his complete lack of empathy were mental traits that were too extreme for popular entertainment. Goodfellas was hugely successful, both with critics and at the box office, introducing Tommy DeSimone's story to millions of viewers who had never heard of the real-life criminal. But the film's success also created a legend around Tommy that was very different from historical reality. The movie's Tommy was a dangerous, but ultimately human character, someone whose violence could be understood within the context of his criminal environment. The real Tommy DeSimone was something far more disturbing, a genuinely psychopathic person whose ability for violence went beyond even the extreme norms of organized crime. His story was not just about the corrupting influence of criminal culture, but about the intersection of mental illness, criminal opportunity, and the social environment that rewarded the very behaviors that made Tommy so dangerous. The cultural impact of Goodfellas went far beyond entertainment. The film influenced public perception of organized crime, created new interest in the history of criminal organizations, and established Tommy DeSimone as one of the most recognizable figures in American crime stories. But this cultural fame came at the cost of historical accuracy, as Tommy's real story was simplified and cleaned up to make it suitable for a wide audience. The story of Tommy DeSimone has had a deep and lasting impact on American criminal culture, serving as both a warning tale and a source of dark fascination for later generations of criminals and crime fans. His reputation as the ultimate wild card, a criminal so dangerous that even other criminals feared him, has become part of the stories that shape how organized crime is understood and shown in popular culture. Within organized crime itself, Tommy's story serves as a powerful example of the consequences of letting violence become a goal in itself, rather than a way to achieve criminal goals. Experienced criminals use Tommy's story to teach younger partners about the importance of controlling violent urges, maintaining professional discipline, and understanding that excessive meanness can become a problem rather than a benefit. The idea of the Tommy DeSimone type has entered the vocabulary of law enforcement and criminal psychology as a way to describe criminals who combine being part of a group with psychopathic personality traits. These people are particularly dangerous because they have access to the resources and protection of criminal organizations, while lacking the self-control and strategic thinking that normally guide organized crime activities. Tommy's story has also influenced how organized crime organizations approach the hiring and management of violent partners. The lesson of Tommy DeSimone is that pure violence, no matter how effective in the short term, becomes counterproductive if it cannot be controlled and directed toward specific goals. Modern criminal organizations have developed more advanced methods for identifying and managing potentially unstable people before they can cause the kind of problems that Tommy created. In the broader context of American criminal stories, Tommy DeSimone holds a unique position as a figure who represents both the appeal and the horror of criminal life. Unlike romanticized criminal figures who are portrayed as Robin Hood-like characters fighting against an unfair system, Tommy represents the pure predatory nature of criminal violence, without any pretense of being noble or having a social purpose. His story serves as a counter-story to the romanticized portrayals of organized crime that dominate popular culture. Where Movies and books often present criminals as complex anti-heroes, motivated by loyalty, honor, and family duties. Tommy's story reveals the brutal reality of criminal life, a world where violence is routine, paranoia is justified, and even the most feared. Individuals can be killed when they become inconvenient. The psychological aspects of Tommy's story have also influenced academic and popular understanding of criminal behavior. His case has been studied by criminal psychologists, forensic psychiatrists, and criminologists as an example of how antisocial personality disorder can show up within organized criminal groups. These studies have contributed to a broader understanding of the relationship between mental illness and criminal behavior. Perhaps most significantly, Tommy's story has become a reference point for discussions about the nature of evil in American society. His actions raise fundamental questions about whether individuals like Tommy are products of their environment, or whether they represent something more fundamental and disturbing about human nature itself. More than 4 decades after Tommy DeSimone's disappearance, big questions about his life and death remain unanswered. These mysteries continue to fascinate crime historians, law enforcement investigators, and popular culture fans, ensuring that Tommy's story remains a subject of ongoing interest and guesswork. Most obvious unanswered question concerns the specific details of Tommy's murder. While law enforcement agencies are confident about who was responsible for his killing, they have never been able to develop the hard evidence needed for a criminal prosecution. The location of his body, the exact method of his murder, and the names of the specific individuals who carried out the killing all remain unknown. This lack of definite information has allowed many theories and legends to develop around Tommy's death. Some stories suggest that he was tortured before being killed, as revenge for the torture he had inflicted on his own victims. Other accounts claim that he was given a chance to fight for his life, in line with some twisted sense of criminal honor. Still, other versions suggest that his killing was quick and professional, with no unnecessary meanness. The truth about Tommy's final moments may never be known, but the persistence of these various accounts shows the continuing fascination with his story, and the human need to find meaning in even the most brutal and senseless violence. Another big mystery involves the extent of Tommy's criminal activities. While Henry Hill's testimony provided detailed information about many of Tommy's crimes, Hill admitted that there were violent incidents he knew nothing about. Tommy's paranoid behavior in his final months, his practice of working alone on many jobs, and his tendency to commit sudden acts of violence suggest that his full criminal record may never be completely known. Law enforcement agencies continue to receive tips about unsolved murders that might be connected to Tommy DeSimone, but the passage of time has made it extremely difficult to check these connections. Physical evidence has broken down or disappeared. Potential witnesses have died or become unreliable, and the criminal organizations that might have records of Tommy's activities have themselves been largely taken apart by decades of his prosecution. The psychological aspects of Tommy's story also remain not fully understood. While it's clear that he showed many characteristics associated with a psychopathic personality disorder, the specific factors that shaped his development into such an extreme example of criminal violence are still debated by experts. Was Tommy's violence primarily a product of his brain chemistry and genes, making him a natural-born killer who would have been dangerous no matter his environment? Or was his criminal career the result of social and cultural factors that channeled his aggressive tendencies toward organized crime? The answer to this question has important implications for understanding and preventing similar cases of extreme criminal violence. The question of Tommy's victims also remains largely unanswered, while some of his murders are well documented through witness testimony and criminal investigations. Other victims of his violence may never be identified. Tommy's habit of committing sudden acts of violence, his practice of killing potential witnesses, and his general lack of concern for human life suggest that his victim count may be significantly higher than officially recognized. Finally, there remains the broader question of Tommy's place in the history of organized crime. Was he an exception, an unusually violent person who happened to be connected to organized crime? Or was he a more typical product of criminal culture, differing from other criminals only in the extent of his violence rather than in its basic nature? This question has important implications for understanding the role of violence in organized crime and the factors that prevent most criminals from falling to Tommy's level of meanness. The answer may help explain why some criminal organizations are able to maintain discipline and control over their members while others produce individuals like Tommy DeSimone, who ultimately threaten the survival of the entire organization. As we reach the end of Tommy DeSimone's blood-soaked story, we are left not with the satisfaction of justice served or lessons learned, but with the haunting realization that some human beings are capable of evil so deep that it is hard to explain. Tommy's story is not just another mob tale of greed, betrayal, and violence. It is a journey into the darkest corners of the human mind, a case study in what happens when natural-born killer instincts are given free rein in a world that rewards violence and punishes weakness. The transformation of Thomas Anthony DeSimone from a troubled child to a feared killer was not a sudden corruption of an innocent person, but rather the slow uncovering of something that had always been there, hiding beneath the surface. The signs were visible from his earliest years: the dead eyes, the absence of empathy, the genuine pleasure he took in others' pain. What organized crime provided was not the corruption of a good man, but rather the perfect environment for a monster to grow. Tommy's story forces us to face uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and the thin line that separates civilized society from the chaos that is always lurking just beneath its surface. In the legitimate world, Tommy's psychological makeup would have likely led to a career as a serial killer, stalking random victims and leaving a trail of senseless murder. But the world of organized crime channeled his violence into a more structured format, giving his killer instincts purpose and direction while providing him with the resources and protection needed to indulge them on a massive scale. The irony of Tommy's life is that his greatest strength as a criminal, his complete willingness to inflict violence without hesitation or regret, ultimately became the weakness that destroyed him. In a world where even hardened killers operated according to certain rules and limits, Tommy's refusal to accept any boundaries made him too dangerous to be allowed to live. He became the monster that even monsters feared, and in doing so, he sealed his own fate. His killing on that cold January night in 1979 was not just the removal of a criminal problem. It was the unavoidable result of a mental path that had been decades in the making. Tommy's paranoid final months, his growing isolation from former friends, and his descent into pure madness were all predictable consequences of a mind that had never developed the capacity for genuine human connection or moral control. The mystery surrounding Tommy's death, the missing body, the wall of silence that has lasted for over 4 decades, the complete absence of physical evidence serves as a fitting end to a life that existed largely in the shadows. Tommy DeSimone lived as a predator, died as prey, and left behind only questions, theories, and the traumatic memories of those who survived encounters with him. Perhaps The most disturbing aspect of Tommy's legacy is how his story has been transformed by popular culture into a source of entertainment and fascination. Not the real Tommy DeSimone, the man who tortured victims for hours simply because he enjoyed their screams, who shot a teenager in the foot for refusing to dance, who turned routine criminal activities into exercises in sadistic meanness, has been sanitized and mythologized into a more acceptable version of evil. This cultural transformation serves a psychological function for audiences who want to experience the thrill of criminal violence without confronting its full horror. The Tommy DeSimone of popular culture is dangerous but understandable, violent but ultimately human. The real Tommy DeSimone was something far more disturbing. A genuine predator whose capacity for evil exceeded even the extreme norms of the criminal underworld. His story serves as a reminder that evil is not always the result of social injustice, childhood trauma, or systemic corruption. Sometimes, evil exists simply because some human beings are born with brain chemistry that makes empathy impossible and cruelty pleasurable. Tommy DeSimone was not a victim of his circumstances who turned to crime out of desperation or misguided loyalty. He was a natural-born killer who found in organized crime the perfect outlet for impulses that would have found expression regardless of his environment. The final lesson of Tommy's story may be that some individuals are simply incompatible with civilized society, regardless of the resources devoted to rehabilitation, treatment, or intervention. Tommy's violence was not a cry for help, a response to trauma, or a product of social conditioning. It was the expression of a fundamental flaw in his psychological makeup that made him incapable of seeing other human beings as anything more than objects to be used or destroyed. In the end, Tommy DeSimone got exactly what his life's path had always been leading toward: a violent death at the hands of people who understood his continued existence posed an unacceptable threat to their own survival. He lived by violence, prospered through violence, and died by violence, completing a circle that had been decades in the making. His story remains relevant today, not because it provides insights into the criminal justice system or the social conditions that produce crime, but because it reminds us that evil exists in its purest form, uninfluenced by rational motivation or understandable psychology. Tommy DeSimone was the monster in human form, the predator disguised as a person, the embodiment of everything that civilized society exists to protect us from. The streets of New York are safer today because Tommy DeSimone is dead, but his story serves as a permanent reminder that there are individuals walking among us whose capacity for evil defies imagination. They may not all find their way into organized crime, but they are out there waiting for the right circumstances to reveal their true nature. Tommy's tale is not just history. It is a warning about the kind of evil that exists in every generation, in every society, waiting for its moment to emerge. And so we end where we began, in the shadows of New York, where predators and prey dance their eternal dance, where violence is money and paranoia is wisdom, where men like Tommy DeSimone rise and fall, according to laws older and more brutal than any written by civilized society. His story is finished, but the darkness that created him remains, ensuring that somewhere, somehow, another monster is waiting to take his place. The legend of Tommy Two Guns lives on, but the man himself is gone, reduced to nothing more than whispered stories, faded police reports, and the nightmares of those who knew him when he walked the earth as the ultimate predator in human form. Tommy's story reminds us that in the world of organized crime, loyalty is temporary, violence is money, and even the most feared can become the most hunted. What do you think really happened to Tommy Two Guns on that cold January night in 1979? Was it Jimmy Burke settling scores after months of paranoid threats? The Lucchese family cleaning house to protect their operations? A coordinated hit ordered by multiple crime families who had suffered under Tommy's unpredictable violence? Or perhaps something else entirely? A scenario so brutal that even the criminal underworld has kept its secrets buried for over 4 decades. The truth is, we may never know the exact details of Tommy's final moments, but what we do know is that his story represents something far more disturbing than typical organized crime. Violence. It is the tale of a genuine predator who found in the mob world the perfect hunting ground for his psychopathic urges. Tommy DeSimone was not just another mobster who got too big for his shoes. He was the monster that even monsters feared. A man whose capacity for violence went beyond even the extreme boundaries of organized crime. His killing was not just business. It was an act of self-preservation by people who understood that some individuals are simply too dangerous to be allowed to exist. Share your theories about Tommy's fate in the comments below. Do you believe Henry Hill's version of events? Do you think there are details about Tommy's crimes that have never come to light? What do you make of the complete silence that has surrounded his murder for over 40 years? If this deep look into the darkest corners of mob history has interested you, there is so much more to explore. The criminal underworld of 1970s. New York produced other figures just as fascinating and far more mysterious. We're planning episodes on the Lufthansa heist plotters who also vanished without a trace, the corrupt cops who made it all possible, and the FBI agents who spent decades trying to solve these cases. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you do not miss any of these incredible stories from the shadows of American crime. If Tommy's tale kept you reading until the very end, show some love with a like and share the story with anyone who appreciates the complex psychology behind true crime. Remember, these stories from the underworld teach us that no matter how powerful or feared you become, in the end, we all answer to someone. Tommy DeSimone thought he was untouchable. But the streets of New York have a way of humbling even the most dangerous predators. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the blood-soaked streets of Brooklyn and Queens, through the twisted mind of a genuine psychopath, and into the heart of one of organized crime's greatest mysteries. Tommy Two Guns may be gone, but his story serves as a permanent reminder of the kind of evil that lurks in the shadows of every society. Sleep well tonight, if you can, because somewhere out there in the neon-lit darkness of cities around the world, there are others like Tommy DeSimone, predators in human form, waiting for their moment to step into the light and remind us all that monsters are real, and they walk among us. Until next time, stay curious about the shadows, but remember, some doors, once opened, can never be closed again.